They were legends, born from different worlds. One was a guitar god, the man who could wring tears out of 6 strings and silence an arena with a single note. The other was not one man, but 3 brothers, voices fused in harmony so tight it sounded like it came from another dimension. For a time, their paths crossed in warmth, friendship, and guidance. Eric Clapton, the bluesman, helping the Bee Gees when the world thought they were finished. But like so many friendships in the cutthroat world of fame, this one didn't last. Because behind the bright lights of Miami studios, behind the falsetto choruses and guitar riffs, a darker story lingered, one of jealousy, silence, and whispers that their friendship had gone cold. Was Clapton proud of what the Bee Gees became, or did he believe they had stolen his sound, his soul, and perhaps his place in the spotlight? That answer begins long before disco. It begins with Clapton himself, a man already haunted by demons before the Bee Gees ever entered his orbit. Eric Patrick Clapton was born in 1945 in Ripley, England. From the start, his life was marked by confusion and secrets. He was raised to believe his grandparents were his parents and that his real mother was his sister. That truth wasn't revealed until he was 9 years old, and it shattered him. He would later say he felt abandoned before he even understood the meaning of the word. Maybe that's why he picked up the guitar, because in its strings there were no lies, no secrets, only truth, raw and loud. By the early 1960s, Clapton had joined the Yardbirds, a band that quickly became known for launching guitar legends. But Clapton was different. He wasn't just playing pop hits. He was obsessed with the blues. Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, B.B. King. He played it like his life depended on it, earning him the nickname Slow Hand. Yet Clapton's life would never move slow. It would move like a storm. He left the Yardbirds, calling their music too commercial, and joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers. There, his reputation soared. People began to write on London walls, "Clapton is God, but gods don't bleed," and Eric Clapton did. In 1966, Clapton co-founded Cream with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. They were explosive, volatile, a supernova of sound, Sunshine of Your Love, White Room. The world had never heard anything like it. Clapton stood center stage, guitar in hand, a god in flesh. But Cream imploded as quickly as they rose. Fights, egos, addictions. Clapton was already drinking heavily, already leaning on substances to numb the chaos inside. He sought salvation in another band, Derek and the Dominoes. And it was here that Clapton's most famous heartbreak would bleed into music. Because Clapton was in love, not just with anyone, but with Pattie Boyd, the wife of his best friend, George Harrison of the Beatles. Clapton's obsession with Pattie consumed him. His longing, his jealousy, his guilt, all poured into the song Layla. A song so raw, so desperate, it sounded like a man crying through his guitar. But the story behind it was even more dramatic. Rumors swirled that Clapton and Harrison had bitter confrontations. Some even claimed fists were raised in private arguments. While never proven, the tension was real enough. Clapton would later admit he spiraled into heroin addiction during this time, hiding from the world, consumed by love and despair. He had the talent of a god, but the heart of a man broken in two. The 1970s brought no peace. Clapton battled heroin, then alcohol. His concerts became unpredictable. Sometimes he dazzled, sometimes he slurred. There are stories, whispered even now, of him collapsing backstage, of bandmates dragging him out to perform while he could barely stand. But music never abandoned him, even when people did. In 1974, Clapton emerged from the shadows of addiction with an album that would change his life, 461 Ocean Boulevard. Recorded in Miami, it was smooth, polished, and modern. It wasn't the raging blues guitar heroics people expected. It was controlled, restrained, radio-ready. It was a rebirth. Songs like I Shot the Sheriff topped the charts. Clapton was back, not as a reckless god, but as a survivor who had learned to play softer, wiser, calmer. And it was this rebirth, born in Miami, that would catch the attention of 3 brothers on the verge of fading into obscurity, the Bee Gees. By 1974, Barry, Robin, and Morris Gibb were shadows of the superstars they once were. The 1960s had been theirs, with hits like Massachusetts, To Love Somebody, and I Started a Joke. Their harmonies were unmatched, their voices unmistakable. But tastes had changed. The Bee Gees were mocked as old-fashioned, their popularity sinking fast. Some critics even called them has-beens before they had reached their 30s. The brothers fought bitterly. Robin once quit the group altogether. Morris drowned his frustrations in alcohol. Barry struggled to keep them together, but even his voice couldn't stop the world from moving on. They needed a way out, a lifeline, a miracle, and that miracle had a name: Eric Clapton. Clapton, now steady, now reborn, saw something in the Bee Gees. Maybe he recognized the desperation in their eyes, the same desperation he had once felt when heroin had nearly destroyed him. He gave them advice that would alter the course of their entire career. He said, "Go to America, go to Miami, record there, get Americanized." It wasn't just advice, it was a roadmap to survival. Clapton had done it, and it had saved him. Now he was passing that torch to the Bee Gees. The brothers listened. They packed their bags, left behind England's cold gray skies, and landed in the sunshine of Miami. And inside Criteria Studios, something happened. A sound was born. A sound that would not only save the Bee Gees, but dominate an entire decade. But reinvention always comes at a price. Because soon, whispers began to spread. Whispers that Eric Clapton's generosity had turned into regret, that the Bee Gees hadn't just been inspired by him, they had copied him. Did Clapton truly believe the Bee Gees stole his sound? Or were the rumors just another invention of a jealous industry eager to pit friend against friend? One thing was certain, the Bee Gees were about to rise higher than anyone could imagine, and Eric Clapton would be left to wonder if he had created his own rivals. Miami, the place where Eric Clapton had rebuilt his life, would now become the birthplace of a Bee Gees resurrection. Criteria Studios sat in North Miami, an unassuming building on 20th Street. Yet inside, legends were being forged. Clapton had walked in broken and walked out reborn. Now 3 brothers were about to attempt the same miracle. But for the Bee Gees, this was not just a career move, it was their last chance. Barry, Robin, and Morris Gibb entered the studio in 1975 with nothing left to lose. Their last albums had stumbled. Their once golden harmonies were mocked as outdated. Even record executives were beginning to doubt them. But the Miami air had a way of loosening chains. Maybe it was the heat, maybe the rhythm of American soul and funk spilling from every radio, or maybe it was the desperation in Barry Gibb's chest. Because in Miami, something changed in Barry, a sound, a falsetto. One night during a jam session, Barry pushed his voice higher than ever before, a shriek, a howl, almost a cry. It wasn't polished, it wasn't even pretty, but it was alive. The brothers looked at each other. They knew it instantly. They had found their new sound. The album they created in Miami was Main Course, and it was no accident that it sounded fresh, funky, and American. Clapton's advice had been clear: reinvent or die. Songs like Jive Talkin and Nights on Broadway hit the charts with a vengeance. The falsetto became Barry's weapon, and the Bee Gees, once mocked, were suddenly relevant again. Audiences couldn't believe it. This wasn't the ballad group of the 1960s. This was sharper, sexier, more dangerous. The Bee Gees were reborn, and at the root of that rebirth was Eric Clapton's simple suggestion: go to Miami. But if Main Course was a rebirth, then what came next was an explosion. Because just 2 years later in 1977, the Bee Gees were invited to contribute songs to a movie soundtrack, a low-budget film about Brooklyn nightlife, disco clubs, and a young man trying to escape his small world. The film was Saturday Night Fever, and the soundtrack would not just revive the Bee Gees, it would make them gods. Stayin Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever. One by one, the songs took over the world. The soundtrack sold over 40 million copies. The Bee Gees became the very definition of disco. Their falsetto harmonies were blasting from car radios, nightclubs, and suburban living rooms in every corner of the globe. And suddenly, Clapton's little piece of advice, his gift of Miami, seemed like it had created a monster bigger than anyone could control. The Bee Gees weren't just successful, they were untouchable. But with success comes whispers, and in the late 1970s the whispers began. Some said Clapton had grown cold toward the brothers, that in private moments he felt they had copied his sound, the smoother, polished grooves he had pioneered on 461 Ocean Boulevard. Others said Clapton's pride had been wounded. After all, he had been the one to revive in Miami. But now, it was the Bee Gees' names plastered across the globe, not his. Was it jealousy, or just coincidence that their friendship seemed to fade the higher the Bee Gees climbed? The rumors spread like wildfire. Tabloids painted the story of Clapton as the bitter mentor, watching his students surpass him. One magazine even claimed Clapton refused to attend Bee Gees events, avoiding them at industry parties. Of course, none of this was ever confirmed. Clapton himself rarely spoke ill of the Bee Gees. In fact, decades later, he would appear in a documentary praising them, saying he was proud if his influence had played a part in their success. But the silence in the late 70s was deafening. No public collaborations, no warm mentions, just distance. And in the music industry, silence speaks louder than words. Meanwhile, the Bee Gees' success only grew, and so did the resentment they faced. By 1979, they were selling out arenas and topping charts like no band since the Beatles. But the backlash had begun. Critics mocked disco as shallow. "Disco sucks" campaigns spread across America. At one infamous event in Chicago, thousands of disco records were blown up in a baseball stadium. And in that explosion, many fans heard something else, an attack on the Bee Gees themselves. The brothers felt the weight of it. They had gone from washed-up balladeers to global superstars to symbols of an entire genre's downfall, all in less than a decade. And through it all, Eric Clapton remained silent, watching, waiting. Some say Clapton pitied them, some say he gloated, others whispered he simply didn't care, that he was too lost in his own demons to notice. Because while the Bee Gees were ruling the charts, Clapton was still battling himself. Alcohol had replaced heroin as his drug of choice. His concerts were often sloppy, his temper infamous. Rumors spread of fights backstage, of drunken rants, of friendships destroyed by his drinking, and behind it all was the pain of his personal life. Clapton's love for Pattie Boyd, the woman he had stolen from George Harrison, had turned into a marriage, but not a happy one. Affairs, fights, and endless drinking turned it toxic. It was as if Clapton could save everyone else, even the Bee Gees, but not himself. By the early 1980s, the Bee Gees had been driven into hiding by the disco backlash. Clapton, meanwhile, was trying to crawl out of the bottle. Both careers had shifted, both were scarred, and whatever warmth had existed between them in Miami seemed long gone. The friendship, it seemed, had gone cold, but was it really jealousy that killed their bond, or was it something darker? Because even as the Bee Gees tried to survive the death of disco and Clapton tried to survive himself, the rumors never stopped. Whispers that Clapton believed they had betrayed him, and whispers that maybe he had betrayed them first. By the early 1980s, disco had been crucified in public. The Bee Gees, once kings of the world, became scapegoats for everything wrong with the genre. Their falsetto harmonies, once celebrated, were suddenly ridiculed. They couldn't walk into a room without hearing the word disco, like it was a curse. And Eric Clapton, he was fighting battles of his own, battles no chart position could heal. The two careers that had risen together in Miami now seemed to move on separate tracks, one in silence, one in shadows, but whispers remained. There were stories, unconfirmed but persistent, that Clapton had quietly distanced himself from the brothers, that while he never attacked them publicly, he spoke with bitterness in private. "Copied my sound," some alleged he had said. "Rode my wave." Of course, there was never proof. Clapton himself never made such accusations in print. But in the music industry, rumors don't need proof to take on a life of their own. Journalists hinted at a rivalry. Gossip writers painted pictures of Clapton watching with envy as Saturday Night Fever eclipsed everything. And while Clapton was too consumed by his drinking to wage any real war, silence can feel like betrayal too. The Bee Gees, for their part, rarely mentioned Clapton at all. Perhaps they were too busy surviving. The post-disco years were cruel, pushing them off radio, dismissing them as relics. The brothers turned to writing songs for others, for Barbra Streisand, Dionne Warwick, and Kenny Rogers. They found success in the shadows, even as their own names struggled to draw applause. And Clapton, his life would plunge even darker. In 1985, Clapton finally checked himself into rehab for alcoholism. He had reached rock bottom. His marriage to Pattie Boyd crumbled. His reputation, once godlike, was in tatters. And then, in 1991, tragedy struck harder than any tabloid rumor could. Clapton's 4-year-old son, Connor, died after falling from a high-rise apartment window in New York. The grief nearly destroyed him. But from that grief came one of his most haunting songs, "Tears in Heaven." The world wept with him. For a moment, Clapton was no longer the guitar god or the bitter rival. He was simply a father in pain, and in that pain the rumors of old rivalries felt meaningless. But still, the silence between Clapton and the Bee Gees remained. They never reunited, never recorded together. There were no public reconciliations, no warm embraces on stage. It was as if their friendship had vanished into thin air, leaving only echoes of what might have been. Decades later, in the 2000s, documentaries began to revisit the Bee Gees' story, and to everyone's surprise, Clapton appeared. But instead of bitterness, there was admiration, pride even. "If that was something initiated by me," he said of their falsetto-driven sound, "then it's one of the great things I've done in my life. No anger, no jealousy, only respect." And yet fans couldn't help but wonder, if Clapton felt this pride all along, why the silence in the 70s and 80s? Why no collaborations? Why no public defense when the Bee Gees were being mocked into exile? Was it shyness, pride, or was the friendship truly gone cold, beyond repair? Rumors continued to swirl, even after time had softened the memories. Some said Clapton could never forgive himself for letting them go, for not standing by them when the world turned. Others said the Bee Gees had quietly resented him, that they believed he gave them advice but withheld true support once they surpassed him. The truth? We may never know. Because in music history, sometimes the loudest feuds aren't the ones fought with words or lawsuits. Sometimes the loudest feuds are fought in silence. Today, Eric Clapton and the Bee Gees stand as titans of different worlds. Clapton, the bluesman who survived addiction, heartbreak, and unimaginable loss, still standing with a guitar in his hands. The Bee Gees immortalized through songs that defined an era, though only Barry Gibb remains alive to tell the tale. Their paths crossed once in Miami, a moment of generosity, advice, and possibility, a friendship that should have lasted forever, but history tells us it didn't. And the silence between them speaks louder than any interview, any rumor, any tabloid headline. So what really happened between Eric Clapton and the Bee Gees? Did jealousy poison the bond? Did Clapton believe they had stolen his sound? Or was it simply life, addiction, fame, and tragedy pulling two legends apart until no words were left to say? We may never know the full story, but perhaps that is the tragedy and the beauty, because sometimes the greatest rivalries aren't the ones fought with fists or insults. They're the ones fought in the quiet distance between friends who never spoke again. Eric Clapton gave the Bee Gees the key to their rebirth. The Bee Gees took that key and unlocked a kingdom bigger than anyone could have imagined. But somewhere in that rise, the bond froze, a friendship gone cold. And maybe, just maybe, that silence was louder than the music itself.